Huawei's revenues soared 23% in the first half of this year, despite a US-led campaign that saw the telecoms giant being banned in May. It posted revenues of $58 billion, as well as a healthy boost to smartphone shipments, which reached 118 million units. That's up 24%. But the company's chairman, Liang Hua, warned of difficulties ahead, which could affect growth in the short term. The news comes on the back of data released from market research firm Canalys, which saw Huawei extending its market share in the Chinese smartphone market. It rose over 10%, further cementing its #1 spot across the mainland. Now that takes Huawei's market share to 38%, up from 27.6% just a year ago. Other competitors, including Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi and Apple, all saw declines in both shipments and market share. The news comes just days after Huawei launched its first ever 5G phone. The firm has been struggling since Washington began a targeted campaign against it over what it called security concerns and banned it from doing business with US companies. Now, for more on this, we're joined in the studio by Shengtao Jin. He's a research analyst from Canalys. Good evening, Shengtao. Good to see you. All right, so these revenue numbers, let's take a look at them. The 23% that we saw in the last year. Right. We also saw that it was up 19% from 19% in 2018. It's still down from the 39% number that we saw in March. Are we seeing signs of an easing here?
Right, so you need to look at two particular business groups here. The first one being the consumer business group, which is mostly made up of its smartphone business. We have seen 8% increase year on year, with 30% increase from China. But its overseas market future still remains uncertain because of the US ban on Huawei.
So still some uncertainty from those
right.
from that blacklist.
Right, and the second business segment is the carriers business segment, and Huawei is very strong in that segment. It has secured over 50 commercial 5G contracts so far, and 5G is just at the beginning stage of development. We expect to see more 5G commercial deals in the years to come.
So this is all despite being on the US blacklist. You mentioned about the 5G launch. You definitely see that this is going to boost its growth. I mean, we are seeing that even in the UK, network carriers are choosing Huawei. Is Huawei the only game in town for overseas providers?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, 5G is vital to a country's economy. If you look at 4G, 4G is the reason why we have global powerhouse like Facebook and Netflix. So no country want to be left behind in the technological upgrade. And in the case of 5G, we have other competitors such as Nokia and Ericsson, but nobody can bring 5G base stations and equipment at this low cost and with this level of efficiency.
All right, so let's zoom in on these Chinese smartphones now. The market there, it is large. We've seen Huawei's market share increase to almost 40%. That is truly significant against its competitors. What accounts for that?
Right, so there are two factors I'd like to talk about. The first one being the brand image. So from late last year, Huawei was the victim of the US sanction, and it was being placed on the entity list. So Huawei's retail partners has been rolling out advertisement linking Huawei as a patriotic brand, and it appeals to a growing demographic of Chinese consumers who are willing to take political considerations in making purchase decisions, right? And the second point I'd like to address is Huawei's recent channel expansion. So Huawei has mentioned that it is intending to increase an additional 4,000 offline retail outlets in China, an already saturated market. So, and the US ban on Huawei certainly exacerbated Huawei's reliance on its whole market.
When you compare the Chinese smartphone market to regionally and internationally, how big is it? What are we looking at?
Well, Chinese smartphone market accounts for about 30% of the world market, and it's probably around half of Asia-Pacific's market. I mean, if you look at Huawei's share in China alone, it's probably at the same level as iPhone's global smartphone shipment.
So let's look at what's happening with its competitors, with Xiaomi, with Vivo, etc., and Oppo. They're losing market share, so how do you account for that?
Right, so this brings back to the earlier points that I mentioned. So Huawei has been very aggressively expanding its offline channels. It has opened 4,000 retail outlets, and at the same time, retail partners are advertising Huawei as the patriotic brand, which is why Huawei is able to achieve a 30% year-on-year growth in China alone.
So taking that view of seeing Huawei as a purchase of a Huawei smartphone as a patriotic gesture,
Right.
as it were, does this mean that Huawei is pivoting towards its own home base, or does it still need its international market?
Well, Huawei definitely wants to expand its international market, but in the short term, there are so many uncertainties revolving around the trade war and whether Huawei can be removed from the entity list or not. So China remains the last resort that Huawei wants to rely on.
Shengtao, thank you very much for shedding light on this research that Canalys has done on Huawei's revenue fortunes. We've been speaking there to Shengtao Jin, research analyst at Canalys.